All right, so what we're going to take a look at in this video here is just a real brief overview of some of the key or major battles of the Civil War. So we're going to touch on those, plus one very important turning point document as well. Okay, so what you'll have there is a chart that helps to just fill in some information about these key these key battles of the Civil War. So first up, we have Fort Sumter. And so Fort Sumter was in April of 1861. Location, Charleston, South Carolina. Its key importance, it is the first battle of the Civil War. It was actually a bloodless battle. There was, ironically, a Confederate horse that died. Now, in the end, the South was forced the Union to surrender the fort. However, it was the Confederacy who fired first on Fort Sumter, so they do initiate this attack. But they really had no choice. If they're going to declare their secession and their independence, this would be a necessary thing. Okay, so go ahead and pause now. Again, with each section, if you need to pause it to make sure you get all your notes, please make sure you do so. All right, next up is the First Battle of Bull Run. Okay, it's also called First Manassas, and this has to do with Manassas being like the town and Bull Run being the name of the creek. Okay, it's First Battle of Bull Run because there will be another one. All right, so this is July of 1861. Location is Northern Virginia. This is in part the Union going after the capital of the Confederacy. They're in Richmond. And P.T. Beauregard, who is the Confederate general, hears about this, and so he sends his troops up to meet the Union Army. So, objective here, well, quite simply, they wanted to capture Richmond, Virginia. Importance, it is the first major land battle of the Civil War. Now, there were some other skirmishes between Sumter and Bull Run, but they were fairly minor. In fact, most of the Civil War, actually, there's like hundreds of battles all across the country. They're minor, they're small, 100, 200, whatever it may be, militias running into each other, that kind of thing. But as far as the first major one, that is here at the First Battle of Bull Run. And one of the things about it is that it proved to both sides that this would be long and costly, and in particular for the North, it proved to them really that the South would not be easily defeated. And so really when both sides thought that at the beginning of this thing, we're talking 3 months, 90 days tops on the length of the war. And so they were most definitely wrong about it, but that was really shown here, okay? All right, next up, here we have the Monitor versus the Miramac. So this is in March of 1862, and this is a naval battle off the coast of Hampton Roads, Virginia. Now, its importance is a couple things. One, part of the Union strategy, their goals was to block off those southern ports, and this particular battle helps to preserve that. Because you see here, this is the first battle of the ironclads. Basically, these are ships made out of metal, or at least a metal armor on them. And so, it's really the Union that pushes it on here. The South was actually the first to develop an ironclad, and they were just decimating the Union ships. And had that been allowed to continue, then they would have just continued to march right along. But what this really shows, it was actually a draw, but it draws enough to preserve the blockade in this case. All right, next up we have the Battle of Antietam. Now this is in September of 1862. Location, Antietam, Maryland, just over the Virginia border, so just a little ways into the north there. So this is one of the things where the South believed a victory on Union soil would help win the backing of Britain and France. So you recall that this is one of the objectives or goals that the South had, was to get foreign support, in much the same way the Americans got foreign support during the American Revolution. So This is definitely the bloodiest battle of the war as far as a single day. Gettysburg will have far more total casualties, but that's over numerous days. As far as a single day, it's Antietam. Now, this is also the first real Union victory um, of sorts as well. All right, and actually 22,000 soldiers they were casualties in one day. It's just insane, the number of dead and wounded and everything that happened in this one battle in this one day. All right, so next up, this would actually be on page 2 or the back side of your notes, depending on how they were printed for you. This is going to be the Emancipation Proclamation. All right, so the Emancipation Proclamation was officially issued on January 1st, 1863. However, Lincoln had actually been telling the southern states that this was coming, and it was one last-ditch effort to try to bring some of them back into the fold, as it were. So this is an order issued by Lincoln that freed the slaves and occupied the South. Now, on a practical standpoint, it doesn't really free any slaves when it's first issued, because a couple things. One, the North doesn't really control any Southern territory, and two, it's only in the rebelling states. So those slave states that were still part of the Union, they kept their slaves from them. But what it does do is that it turned the British and the French away from sort of supporting the Confederacy. Made slavery the front and center issue. Like, you couldn't just ignore it, like they've been doing for forever. So everyone was when it came to the South and cotton and all these things. And in many ways, it actually mentions and references the Declaration of Independence. This is actually a pretty common theme throughout U.S. history, that the Declaration of Independence is because it's the starting point in many ways of the country even existing, because it talks about we're asserting our right to be free, unalienable rights, these kinds of things, this type of language. And so this is repeated in the Emancipation Proclamation. So Gettysburg is July of 1863. Now, the picture you see here is an actual picture from after the Battle of Gettysburg. Okay? So it's located in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, which is just over the so-called Mason-Dixon line. Importance of Gettysburg. First of all, this is where General Robert E. Lee, he had really hoped that if he was to go up into Union soil and have a significant victory, that the North would lose its will to fight. And he probably wasn't wrong about this, because there were a lot of people that got freaked out just knowing his army was in the North, much less winning any kind of battles or anything like that. Okay? And it ends up being the turning point of the Civil War. All right, now Gettysburg is a Union victory, and it's a very close Union victory at the end of the day. But it's a turning point not only in the victory itself, but in how much Lee loses in his army. Robert E. Lee is by far and away the best general in the entire Civil War on either side, and his army, it's a matter of attrition. There's only so many people in the South, and his army is only so big. And every time they get into these battles and they lose, even if they win the battle, the casualties begin to add up, particularly after Gettysburg. He also loses Stonewall Jackson, who is one of his best subordinates. And that is a key loss, not only in the terms of the war itself, but in particular in Gettysburg in general. Now, from May to July of 1863, you have the siege or Battle of Vicksburg. This is located in Vicksburg, Mississippi, along the Mississippi River. Now, at the end of the day, this is what really pushes Grant's reputation and led to a promotion as General-in-Chief of all of Union forces. Okay, so Grant is one of those people that started off the war as basically being accused of a drunkard, and his job was to just help new recruits coming in, like getting them signed up. That was it. And here we are just a couple of years after that, he's being placed in charge of the entire Union Army. Now, Vicksburg was the last holdout for the South on the Mississippi River, which was a key transportation conduit for them. And so Vicksburg is the last holdout. And so with this victory, the North now has control of the Mississippi. So basically, right on top of each other, you have the Battle of Gettysburg and Vicksburg, and these are both major Union victories in July of '63. All right, so sort of next up for us today is the Battle of Chattanooga. So this is actually a series of battles in October and November of 1863. Now, Chattanooga is in Tennessee. It's really right on the border between Tennessee and Georgia. Now, if you recall, back in one of the goals and objectives for the North was the capture of Chattanooga. So they accomplished this, and in so doing, they control the major railroads leading into and around the South. This cuts off Confederate supply routes, whether it be armies for the North or anywhere else. Okay, so this is a huge victory, and so this is a succession of victories, rather, for the North between July of '63 and really November of '63. So this is a major swing time in this. All right, now this will eventually lead to Sherman's March to the Sea. Okay, now Sherman's March to the Sea is a series of battles start in November of '64 through March of '65. All right, and so the battles were from Atlanta to Savannah. The goal here was to be, first of all, take the major railroad junction in Atlanta. So they had taken Chattanooga, cut that off. Now the next big one was down in Atlanta. And then if they take that, then they go down to the seaport of Savannah. And his idea was not only would he cut off these two major hubs of transportation and supplies and these kinds of things, but also he's going to destroy everything in the path. So this has a dual effect of trying to break the will of the people and cutting the Confederacy again. So the capture of the Mississippi River divides east and west, cutting from basically Chattanooga all the way down to Savannah. That further divides the Confederacy. So this is what was called total war. And this is something that we saw much more so in the 20th century, particularly like World War II, for example. Wasn't so common in this era, but many people looked at Sherman at the beginning of the war and thought he was crazy. In fact, he was removed from service. He's one of the first ones that said this will not be a short war. And he listed the number of troops that he thought it would take to control the Confederacy in different places, and people thought he was crazy. And yet, he was right on a lot of things. And so he was a very driven man, to say the least. All right, so the last one we're going to take a look at here is Appomattox Courthouse. This is in April of 1865. And the location, it is Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. That is the town name, Appomattox Courthouse. And so what you had here is you had the Union General Ulysses S. Grant, Confederate General Robert E. Lee. And so they're there to battle, as it were. Okay, this is April of '65. This is almost exactly 4 years after the attack on Fort Sumter. So this ends up being the ending of the fighting in the Civil War. Okay, this is the last battle. Lee surrenders to Grant, and this is it. And again, this is almost exactly 4 years to the beginning of the war. All right, so there you go. So if you missed any of these notes, definitely make sure you go back and get them.